Welcome back. Well, it's been a long time since I mentioned the word Brexit on the show, but we're on. On Tuesday, Australia's High Commissioner in London, George Brandis, announced that Britain and Australia will shortly be commencing formal talks on a free trade agreement. Joining me now, Chief Executive of the Australia-British Chamber of Commerce, David McCredie. David, thanks for joining us. Now, exactly what does this mean, formal talks commencing?
Well, thanks, Tikki, for having me on. It's always great to speak to you. Well, we're at the precipice. We're at the start of the negotiation to enhance the Australian-UK trading relationship and investment relationship through a formal negotiation, which most are suggesting will start in a couple of weeks around the middle of June.
That's incredible. But, I mean, when you think about it, this pandemic, it really has hit the world, but it's hit Britain as well economically, hasn't it?
Yes, it has, but it's been quite interesting to see that the machinery of government, particularly around Brexit and the free trade agreements that it's trying to strike with other countries, has really gone on fairly much unabated. We saw the US negotiations kick off. We've seen the Japanese paperwork in terms of the UK's position in terms of what they want out of a strategic relationship going forward. That's been released. And Australia and New Zealand are the next cabs off the rank. So these things have been going on. And then between the EU and the UK, they've had 3 rounds of negotiation. They haven't necessarily got right to the end of that yet. They've got another round of negotiations this week. It's all been done via Zoom or whatever the preferred methodology is for the EU-UK.
Yes.
And they're down to the nitty-gritty. They've got quite a lot, I think, under their belt. But it's the really sticky issues that are left that they need to get through. And it's seen some rather extraordinary things happen in terms of David Frost announcing or putting out the UK's position, where they're finding difficulties, releasing the draft text, and basically trying to put the onus back on the EU to really come to the table more pragmatically and in line with other free trade agreements that they've got already.
Exactly. So Michel Barnier didn't seem to be that impressed with the approach from the British government. But it's really interesting in that not even in this time when all nations are under pressure, Britain seems to be standing strong on firm negotiations, which presumably is upside for Australia.
Well, yes, it is an upside for Australia. Clearly, any improvement in the Australia-UK relationship will be beneficial to Australia. It goes without saying. The interesting thing from an Australian perspective, of course, is we've now been through the 7th round of negotiations between Australia and the EU, and that's something that at the Australian-British Chamber we're very keen to see Australia get that deal done as well. And it will help us as Australians to be able to export and invest more into Europe and attract more investment, which, going back to your earlier stories around things like advanced manufacturing in Australia, that sort of input, particularly from Europe and from my point of view, obviously, particularly from the UK, is going to be a really strong part of Australia's recovery from COVID.
David, do you think there's any reason to believe that the free trade agreement between the UK and Australia might be seen from Britain as, one of the more promising ones? And if so, why?
Well, I definitely think so. I think the challenges that we're seeing in the US, not least of which over the last few days, but more broadly in terms of the context of the US is going to an election at the end of the year. You've got a Democratic Congress. You've got a Republican president. So the chances of actually landing a deal with the US are probably fairly slim before the end of the year. In terms of the EU, obviously the UK is very hopeful of getting that done before the June deadline, where they need to decide whether to extend or not. So that's probably hopeful, but there's still a long way to go there. In terms of Japan and others, there are opportunities, but Australia, I think, is the most like-minded. We have so many complementarities in terms of our industry and trade. And our outlook on the world. So I think we are a very promising opportunity for the UK and quite possibly the first one to be done. Whether or not that's before the EU, I doubt it would be before the EU, but it'd be certainly one of the ones that will be trumpeted from the UK's point of view, particularly from Brexiteers, as it's a country outside of the EU that it will have done a deal with.
Exactly. Now, I was really interested in the developments around Five Eyes and cyber because, of course, the services sector is so important for Australia. We see opportunities there in this free trade agreement, I think. Now, in Britain, Boris Johnson, at the beginning of the year, was welcoming Huawei to be involved in its 5G. Now, it would seem that has changed somewhat. To what degree could that help a free trade agreement, do you think?
Look, I think fundamentally the Huawei decision is really about maintaining our own security and being confident that those in the supply chain and those who are managing the networks that are of critical importance to our infrastructure are done in a way which we know they are friendly participants. And clearly the view of other Five Eyes nations has been that Huawei doesn't meet that criteria, that there is some suggestion that potentially the state, the Chinese state, has too much interest in that, and that it may be otherwise looking for information or others through that participation. What does it mean for the rest of us? Well, I think there's a great opportunity for us to really re-look at our supply chains and decide what we want to be part of in the future. I think one of the things that this crisis has taught us more broadly is that you can't put all your eggs in one basket, whether that's supply chains or markets, and we need to look at a breadth of opportunity, which brings that greater opportunity brings the sorts of things that we always talk about in terms of encouraging companies to export. We know that they are more successful.
Yeah, finally, because we're running out of time, but the whole issue of people movement, I would presume, is another very important area for the FTA. We weren't exempted from the 14-day quarantine restrictions. Are we going to get any special exemptions when it comes to, or good deals when it comes to people movement?
Look, in terms of people movement, in the broader scenario over the longer term, I think we will see some benefits out of this free trade agreement. I know there's a lot of talk about how we open up our borders to make sure that we've got the right skills and talent. We have to remember we're in a global war for talent, and if we want the best people in the world working on our infrastructure programs, in our government, and indeed in our private sector, then we need to have the ability to attract them to this country. In the short term, obviously there's a 14-day quarantine, but Australia, and I know George Brandis in particular, has been negotiating hard with the UK government to try and find a way to relax that, seeing as we've dealt with COVID so much better than everyone else in the world.
Indeed. David McCredie, I'd like to keep in touch on this. Thank you very much for joining us.